What is up, everybody? It is RCA Apologist, and we were having some technological deficiencies. I think that is the proper way to say it, since it's on that one movie that's full of scientific accuracies, which is known as Idiocracy. So, anyways, we are going to be having a debate that's been scheduled and rescheduled over times. It is essentially the question: is the Old Testament polytheistic? So, because we don't have a moderator for this, we're going to be gentlemen. We have been in several debates before. We know the whole format. So much enough that we are going to know when to restrict ourselves and to stay on schedule and follow the proper format of the debate. So, here's the exactly. As you can tell, there's our lovely fellow debater Chris, who is part of Biblical History Skeptics. Did I get it right or did I get that wrong? Sounds pretty much like what I do. So we're gonna be doing this, and if y'all want, one thing I want to try to do is get like a thing where we do, since people were expecting this to be on the Modern Day Debate channel, and one thing that is familiar with that is the Q&A section. We will try to reserve a 15-minute Q&A. Oh, wait a minute. No wonder. I'm sorry about that, folks. I had Chris muted on the thing here, so now we can actually hear him. So sorry about. Now we can hear you. Yeah. In fact, so much that you're just like mine. Yours is peaking on the red, which, in my opinion,
okay,
no. That's a good thing, in my opinion. That's a good thing, in all honesty, in my opinion. So that being said,
Is it better now?
yes. If I can get the levels off of you, that means we can hear you. But yeah, History and Brack pointed out that they can't hear you, so that now we can hear you. So that's my bad. So yeah, you were right, though they couldn't hear you that time. I am not doing such a good job. But anyways, the point being is we're gonna get to this debate, and we're gonna get to it. So let me just explain the rules. So from how we agreed to it, 10-minute opening statements, 4 rounds of 5-minute cross rebuttal periods, and then we're going to get to a 10-minute cross-examination period, followed by 5-minute closing statements, and then again we're going to do the 15-minute open question from all of y'all in the live chat. So if y'all know anybody that would be interested in this, share the link and get this spread out, so that way we can get them good big numbers open towards those that were waiting for this debate but saw that it wasn't going to happen on the Modern Day Debate channel. So anyways, since Chris is in the affirmative on this position, he will be the one that will start us off. So Chris, you said you're going to be able to time yourself, so whenever you're ready, you may begin.
Okay, starting now. So, is the Bible monotheistic? And does it have polytheism in it? My stance is it depends on where you look and at what time period we're discussing. The Bible is not a singular piece of literature, but the product of a long and complicated construction from numerous sources and numerous times. It is not a monolith. As such, my stance will come to the conclusion that there is not it will not come to the conclusion that there is no monotheism. Quite to the contrary, as Mark S. Smith points out in the Origins of Biblical Monotheism, Isaiah 40 through 55 is very strongly oriented towards monotheism. But because this is not monolithic, we have to look at some other passages, and in quite some amount of detail. But the first question is going to be, how do we define a god so that we can talk about polytheism? In the context of the ancient Near East, including Israel, gods took many shapes, forms, and types. For a more modern take on the definition of polytheism, philosopher Stephen Dillon, whose definition is based on 3 properties of godhood: disembodied consciousness, immensely more powerful than evolved minds, and remarkable greatness, all of which I argue these deities have here. I'd suggest checking out his work on that. You can also check out a video by Ocean on that, and I want to thank Ocean also for giving me this info. So with that definition, the definition that he has set up in mind, I'm just going to go straight into it. So generally, a plurality of gods is referred to in Northwest Semitic languages as Elohim, or cognates like Elim and such like that, which is, when not referring to Yahweh, a masculine plural noun. The best way to define them is to simply then look at what constituted deities in the ancient Near East, and this will give us our broadest sense of the word. To give us examples, for example, in Ugaritic texts and also in 1 Samuel 28, we find that the dead, the people who have passed on, do qualify as gods when the king of Israel, King Saul, asks the witch of Endor, "What is it that you see?" when they're practicing a divination act. She says, "I see Elohim. I see gods rising from the depths of the underworld." And we know for a fact that they were worshiping them as gods. We have the archaeological evidence to show this, and we also have the fact that they're literally being called gods. This is paralleled again in the Ugaritic texts and in inscriptions and funerary works as well, and also in Akkadian texts, which John Walton notes the term Elu, gods, in a similar fashion in regard to certain dead figures. As such, in both the Bible and outside the ancient Near Eastern literature, dead men can be considered gods. We also find evidence of this cult of the dead where they were worshiping gods in Isaiah 56 through 57, Amos 6, and in Jeremiah 16. What else then constitutes a god? Angels, in fact, do. As Mark S. Smith notes in The Origins of Biblical Monotheism, we find their exact counterparts, including the cognate terms, so malach, at Ugarit. The angels were, in fact, messenger deities. So they were basically akin to Hermes in the Greek pantheon in a way. We also have instances where humans are considered gods. So, for example, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and also in the Book of Enoch, we have the deification of Enoch himself, where he is created the highest of all the angels. We have Moses deified in a Dead Sea Scroll. We have a priest who is deified, and we also have the author of a Dead Sea Scroll deifies himself. Likewise, we also have divine status that is also given to humans in Psalm 2, as well as Psalm 110. In Psalm 110 specifically, it says, "Yahweh says to my Lord," that's the Lord of Israel, "sit at my right hand." Here we have a God placing humans at the right hand of God. This is typically the place of high divinities, usually the closest ones to the head god. Also, this is interestingly enough, also the same position that other figures have taken as well, other angelic figures. We also have the Satan. The Satan is also considered a god, which Peter Enns notes in The Bible Tells Me So. However, in terms of what I guess I will refer to them as more classical divinities, like the ruling tiers of the gods. So like in Ugaritic pantheon, the first two tiers. We also have their presence heavily featured in the Bible. Norman C. Hable noted that in Genesis 14:18 through 20, which is the Melchizedek episode, we find reference to an El Elyon who is the procreator of heaven and earth. As has been attested in numerous studies all over, Genesis 14:18 through 20 is not actually an original part of the book of Genesis, but was an addition at some point, and is an older addition at that. It is from a much older tradition. We know this from the language, the style, and also from the fact that it interrupts the narrative flow with no explanation. We also know that many early Jews regarded Jerusalem and Melchizedek as originally Canaanite. Jerusalem was said to have been conquered by Joshua from Adonizedek in the book of Joshua, for example. So who is this El Elyon? Well, we can learn from the Karatepe inscription, Ugaritic text, the Ajrud Wall 4.2 inscription, and from the Sephira 1 treaty that not only is El, the Canaanite god, referred to as maker of heaven and earth, the progenitor of the gods, and heavily associated with splitting of the nations, but Sephira 1 and Ajrud Wall inscription 4.2 also use the term cognates of the term Elyon in reference to this being. So this is all El epithet. There has been contention based on Philobiblos, I'm going to note, but as Hebel notes, the strong associations of El himself with the deeds of creating heaven and earth need not actually render these contentions actually valid. And furthermore, the Elyon in the Philobiblos is actually referring to Adonis, not to. So there is no separate god Elyon as has previously supposed. Thus, in Genesis 14:18 through 20, the god El of the Canaanites has reared his face in the Bible. To read this in light of other parts of Genesis also would be somewhat anachronistic, because this is again an older tradition. It is not originally a part. And also, but if we wanted to read it with some of the rest, we could look at Genesis 14:22. Which actually has a textual variant where they added the name Yahweh to El Elyon, creator of heaven and earth, basically as a method of counteracting previous. There is also Deuteronomy 32:8-9. In this passage, we have El, who is the head god above Yahweh, and he grants Yahweh an inheritance. This is we also see Numbers 24, which reflects the prophet Balaam. We know from the Dire Allah oracles that Balaam is a Canaanite deity, or not a prophet, associated with the god El and associated with several other gods. This was then incorporated into the book of Numbers. We also have the plagues of Egypt, where Yahweh literally says, "I shall pass judgment on the gods of Egypt," an act that is only actually applicable if those gods exist. We also have Yahweh and Chemosh with the battle of the male battling each other, as noted in the Moabite Stela, and also then shortened in the Book of Kings. And then we also have further evidence of other deities. So the primordial beasts like Leviathan, which is that all the episodes of God defeating Leviathan come from Canaanite literature that Baal originally did. These views that I'm promoting are not unorthodox views. These are the views of the mainstream. John Day, Patrick Miller, Mark Smith, Norman Habel, William Deaver, Emmanuel Toff, Frank Moore Cross, David Noel Friedman, Michael Coogan, and numerous others have all attested to these views. I will close by quoting the Song of the Sea in Exodus. "Who among the gods is like you, O Yahweh? If there were no gods, how could Yahweh be compared to them to say he is greater?" And that's all.
All right. Well, thank you very much for that, Chris. So, by the way, for all of y'all that are tuning in, if y'all do have any questions, like any actual questions, feel free again to put them into the chat, and we should be able to get that started. But anyways, I will start with my 10-minute opening statements and begin. So, first of all, thanks to Chris for participating in this, and that we were able to get this arranged in such a format that we could proceed without much difficulty. Now, is the Old Testament polytheistic, or in my case, monotheistic? It will be up to my opponent to prove that polytheism, or anything else besides Jewish monotheism, is in the Bible. And I use that phrase, Jewish monotheism, very interestingly there, because there's more than just one simple way of defining it as we have in the traditional sense, and then there's a scholarly sense of understanding Jewish monotheism. But my aim is to prove that the concept of the teachings in the Old Testament are focused in a monotheistic context, just like how the Quran is centered in a teaching of monotheism, and various other religions that could be in a form of monotheism is in that focus. So, the worship, the religion being monotheistic, especially in light of its text, Old Testament teaching monotheism. Some of the examples will be, for example, Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 35, which says, "Unto thee it was showed that thou mightest know that the Lord, he is God. There is none else besides him." Deuteronomy 6:4, also known as the Shema, where it says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord." Psalm 83, verse 18, "That men may know that thou, whose name alone is Jehovah," or Lord in certain translations, "art the most high over all the earth." Psalm 86, verse 10 says, "For thou art great and dost wondrous things. Thou art God alone." Isaiah 44, verse 6, being the last one I'll cite for now, at the moment, is, "Thus saith the Lord, the King of Israel, and his Redeemer, the Lord of hosts. I am the first, and I am the last. And beside me there is no God." So, before we continue onwards with the discussion, we must make a distinction here about concerning the word Elohim and its relation to the view of monotheism that I will be defending today. I will not be defending what some people try to propose, which is the idea that there is literally no other gods, and hence some people may take position along the idea that these Elohim usually are just in simply reference to men, whereas I take a different approach. Merriam-Webster defines monotheism as the doctrine or belief that there is but one God, where it explains the first usage of the word is from the 1660. So the year 1660 is the first usage of this word. So this concept of monotheism with the word that is used here is something that is much more modern compared to what we would find back then in the ancient. They didn't use the word monotheistic, but we can certainly see a sense of it. So the definition of monotheism that I will be defending, which allows the use of this so-called gods or Elohim to be in existence, is that of a monotheism which is referred to the other divine beings which were called Elohim, but that the Elohim who is Lord over all creation and that is unlike his creation is Yahweh. This is important since we do see mention of these gods that are not to be worshipped, and especially seeing that they are mentioned in Psalm 82. While most in my conservative evangelical camp affirm that Psalm 82 refers to men, I will be defending the position that these refer to angels. So the definition I will work with comes from the short article at Bible Odyssey entitled "Monotheism in the Hebrew Bible," where Dr. Benjamin Sommer says the following, quote, "If we adopt the common definition of monotheism as the belief that no deities exist other than the one God, then the Hebrew Bible is not a monotheistic work." He goes on to say, "Monotheism, then, is the belief that one supreme being exists, whose will is sovereign over all other beings. These other beings may include some who live in heaven and who are, in the normal course of events, immortal, but they are subservient to the unique supreme being, unless that being voluntarily relinquishes a measure of control. It is not the number of divine beings that matters to monotheism, but the relationships between them. A theology in which no one deity has ultimate power over all aspects of the universe is polytheistic. Even if a theology in which one deity has supreme powers is monotheistic, even if it knows other heavenly beings." And that's the end of it. Divine beings exist when we read the following, quote, Exodus 12:12, "For I will pass through the land of Egypt this night, and will smite all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast. And against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am the Lord." The word used there is the Elohim. Psalm 82, verse 1. Psalm of Asaph, "God standeth in the congregation of the mighty, he judgeth among the gods." So, question, how do we tackle this? Let's take a look at the definition for this in Heiser's book, Angels, which is a more recent publication that does deal with this, where he says on page 10, quote, "The biblical writers refer to the members of God's heavenly host as gods, lesser divine beings, in his heavenly council or assembly." On page 12, Heiser writes, quote, Briefly, one will find Elohim in the Hebrew Bible employed to describe spiritual beings that are clearly lesser than the God of Israel. While Elohim is used thousands of times for the singular God of Israel, it is used for spiritual beings judged by the God of the Bible in Psalm 82, gods and goddesses of surrounding nations, Judges 11, verse 24, and 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 33, territorial spirits, in Hebrew Shedim, often translated as demons, which is seen in Deuteronomy 32, ayah 7, or verse 17. Sorry, I got my Quran almost mixed into there. And the spirits of deceased people, 1 Samuel chapter 28, verse 13. No biblical author would think that the deceased, dead, or territorial spirits shared the same attributes and power as the God of Israel. The term is not intended to speak of a unique set of attributes as though the God of Israel was just one of many equals. Biblical writers were not expressing polytheism. They used Elohim in contexts that require a plural meaning for the term. The fact that he goes on to say the fact that biblical writers label a range of entities as Elohim that they elsewhere take pains to distinguish as lesser than Yahweh tells us quite clearly that we ought not understand Elohim as having to do with unique set of attributes possessed by only one being. So while the Bible has references to these other different gods or other spiritual beings, this does not mean they are gods like Yahweh. These are simply spiritual beings, and if we die, regardless of where we end up concerning our relationship to God, we will be Elohim. However, Yahweh is different over all the rest of the Elohim and is unique in his attributes. Hence why Isaiah 46 verse 9 says, "Remember the former things of old, for I am God, and there is none like else, and I am God, and there is none like me." Now, are there polytheists as well as concerning polytheism in the Bible? Sure. Bill T. Arnold and Richard S. Hess note in Ancient Israel's History, An Introduction to Issues and Sources, page 128, he says Canaanite in the Old Testament denotes someone in Canaan who represents the polytheistic culture that the Hebrews sought to replace with a culture oriented around devotion to the one God, Yahweh, and obedience to his covenant. So not only is polytheism mentioned in the Old Testament, it is something which is being sought to replace and conquer, to replace the worship we see in polytheism with the worship we see in monotheism. Now, I don't have enough time to go over some of the various other different issues here, but I will at least simply say this. When it comes to the issues that we have proposed here, the main essential message of the Old Testament is that monotheism is indeed there. That indeed there is only one God who is unique compared to others. This is not henotheism, this is not polytheism, but it is strictly monotheism in its most historical and biblical sense of the Old Testament period. Whatever variety this comes from is up to interpretation of whether it be Unitarianism, the two powers in heaven theology, the Trinitarianism view, or even, as Benjamin Sommer notes, the 50-in-1 view that can be examined from certain branches of the Kabbalah school of Jewish mysticism. So, for my opponent, he has to demonstrate that this message and my definition of monotheism is something that is not able to be found within the text of the Hebrew Scriptures, specifically of the Old Testament, whether it be in the Torah, in the prophets, or just the entire Tanakh in general. If my opponent can demonstrate this, then he will be able to win this debate. And with that, I end my time, and we now begin our first set of cross rebuttal periods with 5 minutes each. So, Chris, whenever you're ready, you may start.
Okay, so one of the problems I have here is actually your definition of monotheism, because what it seemed to me is you said that there are these other divine beings slash gods quasi, but that Yahweh is incomparable and the highest, and therefore monotheistic. Is that correct? I don't want to misconstrue what you're saying.
Well, to a degree, yeah, but I would say that we try not to interact as much in the rebuttal period that we save for the cross-examination.
Yeah. Okay. So, So the problem I have there is that that's not actually monotheism. That is monolatry. Not the highest god in a pantheon is not going to be comparable to the other gods, but that doesn't mean that there aren't other gods, and it doesn't mean they don't believe that there are other gods, and it doesn't mean that it isn't polytheistic. So that the problem is that yes, Yahweh is presented as incomparable to the other gods, but that doesn't negate polytheism by any means, because the gods are not all equal in any polytheistic structure. But for example, there's also passages though that hint that he was not always the highest god in the pantheon. For example, when the Most High Elyon allotted peoples for inheritance, when he divvied up humanity, he fixed the boundaries for the peoples according to the number of the sons of El. For Yahweh's portion is his people, Jacob his own inheritance. Jan Houston, in a recent article, showed that the most likely original variant of Deuteronomy 32:8 was that it originally read "sons of Bull-El," hence why we ended up with the reading "sons of Israel," because of basically the answer to that was that it ended up being a dittography of the Yod and then a combination of words, both of which are exceedingly common scribal mistakes that happen. So in this passage, it would appear that Yahweh was the underling to El Elyon. Psalm 82 likewise also indicates that. James Trotter has shown that the entire passage is predicated on Yahweh being below El in the pantheon, and then what ends up happening is that Yahweh takes over. He ascends to the highest position. So, and this has direct parallels in Akkadian mythology, as well as somewhat close parallels in Ugaritic material as well. The appearance would then be that Yahweh was not always the highest god. So, in that case, I want to know what. Actually, one last thing, because I think my time is probably coming close up here. We also know for a fact that Deuteronomy 32 is not originally a part of Deuteronomy either. It is a very old tradition back to when they were still very intermixed with Canaanite culture as well. David Robertson and Simon Solomon Negosian have both argued that it probably dates as far back as the 10th century BCE. So it's far before the Deuteronomic history was ever produced and is separate from the rest of it. So it can't be read in light of Deuteronomy 4 like Heiser tries. And it is and because of that, it's also before Yahweh and El were merged, as Marcus Smith notes as well. And I'll leave it there.
All right, thank you for that. And I guess at that point, I shall begin my particular section. So let me begin starting now. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and point out that with what was cited in 1 Samuel 28 during my opponent's opening statement, that there is indeed a reference to Elohim in reference to the gods that are coming up. But if we read the entirety of the context, we see something interesting. Starting in verse 13 to verse 14, "And the king said unto her, Be not afraid, for what sawest thou? And the woman said unto Saul, I saw gods ascending out of the earth, saw Elohim ascending out of the earth. And," this is where we get to the next verse, "and he said unto her, What form is he of?" So we have it now in reference of a singular of what form is he of. "And she said, An old man cometh up, and he is covered with a mantle. And Saul perceived that it was Samuel, and he stooped with his face to the ground and bowed himself." So there are times when Elohim can be used, and it does end up referring to something in the concept of singular, even though we do know that Elohim is in itself a plural concept. So that is something to keep in mind, that the context is what helps us define when a certain aspect is being used, if it's referring to a plural of the Elohim in general or a specific one. The textual variant that was mentioned concerning the Yahweh and different names of gods is not really referring to a variant of different deities, but rather it is one scribe preferring to use one name of God over another. The definition I provided is considered monolatry by modern society standards. Remember, I said that my definition was a historical one on the concept, that we were focused on something on history. So my opponent brought up the names of different names for God, or these different gods supposedly that exist. My whole contention with that is simple, that concerning these things, for example, like Yahweh, El, Elyon, or any of these other things. These are just simply different titles for God within the Hebrew language. So it's equivalent to when ancient rulers had different names and titles. For example, Alexander the Great had another name that was used during ancient antiquity, Dul-Qarnayn. Dul-Qarnayn, the name means two horns, and there existed coins we discovered that even depict Alexander the Great with two horns, thus fitting the context of the identification. And in Surah 18, Ayah 83 to 101 of the Quran, we read of the figure only going by the name Dul-Qarnayn, not Alexander the Great. However, as Richard Stoneman notes in Ancient Novel and Beyond, we read at page 8, the two names were already synonymous when Muhammad came to compose this surah of the Quran. He goes on to say the commentators of the Quran universally assumed that Dul-Qarnayn here is a name of Alexander, and then says their assumption was clearly correct, since the two stories here associated with Dul-Qarnayn are precisely those two associated with Alexander in the Syriac legend of Alexander, currently shortly before the composition of the Quran. So it's not just the Quran, but even other legends and writings out there, including that of an Arabic poet that was a contemporary of Muhammad, was using the name Dul-Qarnayn as a reference to Alexander the Great. Does this mean these are two separate figures that are out there? No, these are the same figure. They just have two different titles and two different names attributed to them. And so we can see this can be resolved easily with, for example, as Umberto Cassuto mentions in his book, The Documentary Hypothesis, on page 31, where he says, quote, it selected the name of Yahweh when the text reflects the Israelite conception of God, which is embodied in the portrayal of Yahweh and finds expression in the attributes traditionally ascribed to him by Israel, particularly in his ethical character. It preferred the name Elohim when the passage implies the abstract idea of the deity prevalent in the international circles of wise men. In fact, not just even there, but in this one bookmark I have concerning this from James Newell in the Holman Illustrated Bible Dictionary on page 471, says the following concerning these other different names. Quote, El was frequently combined with nouns or adjectives to express the name for God with references to particular attributes or characteristics of his being. El Shaddai, God Almighty, appears in Genesis 17:1. Elohe Israel, Genesis 33:20, was used to distinguish the God of Israel from all others. El Elyon, as we have heard, Genesis 14:18 and Psalm 78 verse 35, was written to suggest the exalted nature of God. El Gibor, Isaiah 9:6 and Jeremiah 32:18, has been interpreted as a portrayal of God as a mighty warrior. El Roi, the God who sees, is found only in Genesis 16 verse 13. So the concept of these different names that are there are ascribing to the same God, but they're just used in a different context to extract a different idea. Hence, what was the context and the intention of the author when we look at what is going on in the scene when a certain name is used, especially in light of certain scribes that may have it within textual variants. And with that, I end my time, and that's our first round. So second round of 5 minutes. Chris, you may begin.
Okie dokie. So the problem I do agree that in many passages they are just interchangeably using El and Elyon in terms like that for God, but there are passages where these beings are differentiated from him. Again, Deuteronomy 32:8-9, and I'm quoting from the translation from David Penchansky this time. It reads that when the Most High apportioned the nations, when he divided humankind, he fixed the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of the sons of the gods. The Lord's portion was his people, Jacob his allotted share. Here, Penchansky is using his translation comes from one of the textual variants at the Dead Sea Scrolls. We know for a fact that this passage was originally indicating polytheism because scribes edited it out. We know that these were not terms being used for God himself, for Yahweh, because the scribes knew that they weren't, and they edited them out of the passage. Luckily for us, they were preserved in certain forms of it, including a truncated variant in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which shortened it from Bull-El to El. The reason that it was altered to Elohim was because Elohim was a term that was heavily associated with Yahweh. And then we also have variants where they had edited to the angels of gods in the Septuagint, and then we also have them where they just edited straight to the sons of Israel instead of the sons of Boel. This is clearly a theological edit because Deuteronomy 32 originally referred to a god that was above Yahweh. The only reason that they would have to edit that out would be if there was a god above him, or if they read it that way. And as Mark S. Smith notes, that the original text is not original to Deuteronomy. It does not come from the reforms of Josiah, which were extremely monotheistic in nature. It comes from almost 2 centuries beforehand. And as such, it is before all of those terms were being associated with Yahweh. They were still different beings. We see that in some archaeological. So we know for a fact that at some point that this passage comes from a time before Yahweh was the highest god in the pantheon yet. He was the chosen god. He was the one that they wanted to worship above all the rest, but he had not yet ascended to the highest part of the pantheon. Psalm 82 also shows this, because Yahweh is standing in the midst of the gods of the Council of El. He's in the midst of it. Now, if you look, and he's the one, and he passes judgment and accusation. And if you look at similar divine council scenes of that type, such as in the book of Zechariah, the accuser is always a lower god. The Satan is not the highest god in the pantheon. But yet he is the one that is going to pass accusations on Joshua in the book of Zechariah. In this passage, in Psalm 82 and in Deuteronomy 32, we have Yahweh as a lower god. This has been noted by scholar after scholar. Just to note a few: Othmar Kiel, David Penchance, James Anderson, David Noel Friedman. David Noel Friedman, I will remind everyone, it was a Presbyterian minister. So and furthermore, we also know we have devout Christian Trygve Medinger, who notes that there were several epithets of other gods being used to refer to those gods in the book of Genesis, like El Olam, which is directly paralleled in Ugaritic material. And we know that they're not referring to Yahweh because they've tried correcting these as well. If these were originally referring to Yahweh, why is it that they had to be corrected? And then finally, also again with Genesis 14:18 through 20, that also had the later edit in verse 22 to try and alter what the meaning of the previous verses, as Emmanuel Tov notes in the textual criticism of the Hebrew Bible. There was a time when biblical writers, some of the writers, were polytheists with a different god than Yahweh as the highest one. And this makes complete sense because the Bible is not monolithic. And that's it.
All right, thank you for that. I will now then begin my time for the 5 minutes for the second half of the second round of the rebuttal period, and we'll start now. So, my opponent brought up Deuteronomy 32 and these other different texts, but right now I just want to focus on Deuteronomy 32. How do we know that Deuteronomy 32 was changed to Yahweh from something supposedly that was a higher god than Yahweh? Is there any manuscript evidence that demonstrates this? Is there any way that we can look at the manuscripts, especially the earliest, that contain, for example, say, a palimpsest, to read previous readings that were erased? Is there anything in the Dead Sea Scrolls or the Septuagint that would seem to indicate something of a different nature? What is the exact evidence? I've heard citations of scholars, and while I don't necessarily discredit the usage of said scholars, I would much rather prefer the case that the evidence that the scholars provide be demonstrated. And I will prove why that's important in another part. So, my opponent admits that the names are interchangeable concerning these different things like El Elohim or El Elyon, Yahweh, and all these other things. And that's good. So there's at least something that's beneficial there. It's that my opponent was able to admit that these terms indeed were interchangeable. However, he still thinks that there is still room and cause for that there's other periods where this doesn't apply and that these indeed do refer to different gods. And this, I would like to see some explained evidence of this. So another thing, how do we know that the scribes removed the names or edited them to change the reference of certain god that different for Yahweh? I mentioned that another thing. I definitely need to see what is the evidence for these claims, because we can have them all out there, but unless we put our cards on the table and show the actual evidence from manuscripts, from the text itself, within the Hebrew, and in light of the context, I don't think we're going to get much far. The Hasatan, as been referred to, the accuser in Job that gets brought up, that it can be easily connected to the divine council of Psalm 82, is nothing more than a higher class angel in the divine council of the sons of God. And we can see this from the concept that, again, these Psalm 82 is in reference to the sons of God, and usually these are in reference to those higher angelic beings that are up there with God, as they are used essentially to carry out certain parts of his will in interaction with the world, as we can especially see in the relation between Yahweh and the Hasatan, in how they interact, not just in the heavenly realm, but also in the physical realm, as we have seen if you have read Job and know how that whole story goes. Now, he brought up Genesis 14:18, which again was the same kind of thing as what was mentioned about Deuteronomy 32, that there was a part of the text that was not part of the original Tanakh, that there is a change that was later edited into it concerning the differences there. And again, I need the evidence of this, because while he cites and says that Emmanuel Tov says this in his book on the textual criticism of the Old Testament, and which, by the way, I have the book, and I would not simply just discredit anything that Emmanuel Tov says just because, anything that would simply contradict my view. It would be that, okay, does he have the evidence to support the notion and can give the argument? I hear Emmanuel Tov, but was not hearing the quote or the specific, exact, detailed argumentation that would have come from the book, or even then again, I don't know if I heard it or not, the page number even to where we could find this. I just simply heard the name of the book. So, do we have any evidence and documentation that can come from Emmanuel Tov on this specific thing on Genesis 14:18, or just any of the other texts concerning any of things? Can we have official manuscript evidence? Can we have anything that we can examine that can point us out that there was indeed an earlier tradition, and that these texts would have originally said something different and referenced something else as a higher deity compared to Yahweh, and then Yahweh, or any of these other ones that would have gotten put in, would be placed in there to fit the narrative? We need to look at the primary sources, and we need to look at the manuscripts when examining this. And with that, I end my time. And third round, your turn, Chris.
Okay, so you asked for manuscript evidence. So on page 282 of Textual Criticism of the Hebrew Bible, Emmanuel Tov, we have two entire manuscript traditions which lack any reference to Yahweh in Genesis 14:22. This is, but in the Masoretic text tradition, as Emmanuel Tov notes, a single word, Yahweh, was added, thus identifying the Most High with the God of Israel, as if Abram was addressing him. However, this is not the original. It was originally a Canaanite text which referred to a different god, because we have two other manuscript traditions that he notes which lack this. Originally, presumably in another line of tradition. I don't know what the symbol stands for off the top of my head, so you just have to look it up. But it reads Ha Elohim, the gods. and this is not referring to Yahweh because of the definite article. It must be a plural. As such, we know that that was originally a polytheistic passage that was not referring to Yahweh in any shape. And if it was, if it was referring to Yahweh, why did they have to add his name in there and replace the reference to the gods and then identify Elyon with? As for Deuteronomy 32, the manuscript evidence comes from the following. Sons of God is in the Masoretic text, it is in the Syriac, it is in the Targum, the Peshitta, and in the Vulgate. The Sons of God, B'nai Elohim, is recorded in the Dead Sea Scroll 4Q Dut J. The Sons of God, Huantheo, from the Greek, is in LXX 848 and also in 106C. And then Angels of God, which was a theological alteration to same as Sons of Israel and same as B'nai Elohim. There are two variants. We have two different Dead Sea Scrolls. One reads B'nai El and one reads B'nai Elohim. We have the Angels of God, Agelon Theo, which is in most of our Septuagint manuscripts. We know from Jan Houston that originally, based on what manuscript evidence we had, that the most original reading was likely Bol El, and that's what accounts for our theological alterations that have been made, as well as also the reading of B'nai Israel, as I noted before, which was caused by a deutography of the Yod and then the combination of the words. We have a lot of evidence for this, and all of these scholars note it in detail. I would add that Emmanuel Taub also notes on Deuteronomy 32 that the B'nai El is reading is from 4Q Dut Q. So we have the manuscript evidence to show that these originally referred to Canaanite gods and were edited out. If these were not referring to Canaanite gods, they shouldn't have been edited out. They should have just left them because they should be just referring to Yahweh. If they were just, or these are coming from previous times, and as Simon Negosian has noted, by the strange use of Matrius Lectionis, by the conservative spellings, and by numerous other factors within the text of Deuteronomy 32, that is an older tradition dating as far back as the 10th century BCE, before El and Yahweh's epithets were syncretized, as Mark S. Smith notes, happening in the 8th century BC. With that, I will yield my time.
All right. And I will begin. Mine will be the second half of the third round. So here we go, starting in 3, 2, 1. Okay. So, concerning the manuscript traditions that were brought up, okay, good. I like, this is things I like in hearing. So, 2 manuscript traditions that don't have Yahweh for the Deuteronomy passage of Deuteronomy 14. So, I've heard the Masoretic text would have this for Yahweh, but what are the 2 manuscript traditions for this particular thing that don't have it? That would be one thing I would be curious about. And I will, of course, concede that I will have to look into a good bit of the references that was brought up concerning, especially on the focus on Deuteronomy 32, in which the manuscripts have pointed out to other things that were brought up, for example, of a sort of a definite article with Elohim that sort of makes it a plural. I will have to take a look into that, especially considering since I've just started studying Hebrew, and I will see if that does come across in my lessons. I've already looked into the whole thing about using the ha in reference to or the hey in reference of a definite article that would be used. So hopefully we get around that in my lessons. So I will have to concede and look into the rest of them. Doesn't mean I admit that there's polytheism or any other sorts that was be it within the biblical Old Testament text, but I will say that I do need to look more into it at that point. So I'll give you some bit of a point for this one right here. However, just because we do have, for example, these other things here, remember, it's not just simply Elohim. Then we have like sons of God that was referenced, and as I stated, I believe that the sons of God that has been referenced, especially that of the Hasatan, is in reference to that of higher angelic beings, higher divine beings, but they aren't higher than Yahweh on the hierarchy of the scale. So we'd have to then try to figure out how we get them being either on equal footing with Yahweh, or that any single one of them, and how do we know which specific one is higher than Yahweh? Because is every single one of them higher and that Yahweh's the low? Or is there a specific one like El Elyon or El Shaddai or any of these other ones? But then what about the other thing? Because I heard Canaanite get tossed around a bit, was out of the whole theology is, you know, these other deities such as Baal or Moloch, are they in any way revolved into the divine council or any of these other different things of these different heavenly realms? Not necessarily saying of just simply being angelic beings, because I know I think anyways that my opponent wouldn't hold that concerning these other ones, or even that the position is a valid one. But would he try to say that these are in some way in the same spiritual realm, and not in some sort of different area based on the mythology or anything concerning this? That would be my question, and for that I'm going to cut my time short there. So we have one last round of the rebuttal period, so whenever you are ready, Chris, you can begin yours.
Okay, so I will say up front, no, the Canaanite gods that we've been associated, you know, like Baal or Dagon or anything, are not. I would not say are a part of God's divine council. There's no indication of that in the text per se. However, they do seem to be real in the biblical text, and that they're real enough that they can be addressed and battled with. However, I will. In God's divine council, we do have one figure that we know for sure, and who is a god, as Peter Enns notes, and I believe it was in chapter 9 or so of the Bible tells me so. He knows that the Satan, Hasatan, is a god. Now you brought up you can actually look at in the book Prophets and Prophecy in the Ancient Near East by Shun Leong So, Robert Rittner, and Marty Nissanen. On page 210, we actually have reference to Shaddai, and it was actually a Canaanite term referencing different deities. And that is also what we end up with when we see Numbers 25 with Balaam. Balaam also is referenced in this book because he's part in the Dire Allah oracles, and he was a prophet of foreign gods originally. Then he was incorporated into the biblical text. So the problem here is that first, the gods do not need to be equal for there to be polytheism. In almost every single culture in ancient history, there was always a high god, a patron deity who was above the rest. El is the highest god in the Canaanite pantheon at Ugarit, followed very closely by Baal and Dagon, but El is still the highest. The Ugaritic Baal. Furthermore, we also have gods at other places by specific cities, Ishtar being the highest. We, in fact, have the parallel to Psalm 82 in Akkadian literature is with Ishtar ascending to become the highest deity. Ronnie Goldstein has done a whole paper on this, noting that Deuteronomy 32 likely is stemming from a tradition of a god usurping the other god and becoming the highest one. So this is it. So this whole argumentation that all these beings have to be equal with Yahweh for it to be polytheistic, I believe, it's a non-argument, because even if we go to monolatry by today's standards, monolatry is still a subset of polytheism. And belief in one God who is above all the rest and unequaled to the rest is still polytheism, because the other gods are still being acknowledged. As long as the gods have the qualities of being a god, as long as they walk like a god, talk like a god, and They are a god. The dead were gods. The dead were worshipped gods. The dead were treated as gods. The dead were celebrated, sacrificed, invoked in divination practice, invoked for healing rituals, etc. They were just as much of a god as Yahweh was. Yahweh was just the highest god. Now, see.
All right. So we were having a. I'm pretty sure some of the people in the audience were able to hear a bit of that. That we were getting some cut in and outs from you. I don't know if it was on your end or if I'm sounding like I'm getting robotic or distorted. I don't know. Hopefully that issue gets worked out. Fortunately, we were able to at least hear parts where it continued, that it wasn't exactly too much of a breaking of your train of thought. So hopefully that substitutes for that. So anyways, I'll begin my last rebuttal before we get into the cross-examination. All right. So I really don't have too much to say for this. All I will say is simply this. Now, first of all, the thing was pointed out about polytheism. Doesn't just simply require equality among the gods, that there can be differences in ranking, and I agree with that. In fact, I mentioned that it's not referring to monolatry or henotheism or any of these other things that would be classified as a category of polytheism. I have always affirmed that would be the case, and I have debated and argued with people that would be under that specific camp. So hence why I even exclude those specific branches. And when I refer to my question about the equality, or in some sense in the same exact kind of rank, just simply of being an Elohim in the sense that it would be similar to that of Yahweh, not in an equality sense, because that would then require the attributes and such. I'm simply asking of how can we know that what my opponent is arguing for the case is actually that. So that is all that I want to point out on that note. So other than that, I really don't think there's much more that I can comment on, since my opponent has brought up some stuff that, as I mentioned, I will have to definitely look more into concerning the specific usage of the word, since he does mention there is a reference into it where a certain article is used that can only indicate a plurality for the term Elohim. And then, of course, these other terms, I will just simply leave it off with this, that out of all those, then, at least keep in mind, as my opponent had admitted, that there are other times where the names Elohim, El Elyon, Yahweh, and various other names that are referenced to God, the one monotheistic God, can indeed be used interchangeably. And as the scholars that I have cited in my notes on the matter, particularly James Newell, professor of Old Testament and Hebrew at Baptist College of Florida, he himself points out these distinctions, as well as the older scholar Umberto Cassuto. So there's context to be kept in mind when examining certain names in the Hebraic biblical text. So that is all I want the audience, as well as my opponent, to keep in mind. And with that, I end my time, and we begin the favorite part of any debate, most likely, and that is the cross-examination. And remind me, did we say 15 or 10 minutes cross-examination?
I think it was 10 minutes each.
Okay, so
if you want to extend that, I'm fine with that.
All right, I'm going to go 10 minutes on the cross-examination. Make sure to keep an eye on the time. Okay, yeah, about 59, so we almost about an hour. So it's about as long as a usual debate. So I was always thinking we were going to be like at 45 or 40 minutes. All right, so we'll go ahead then. Since it's your turn, you may begin when ready.
Okay. So one thing that I didn't see being addressed, and I'm curious as to what your position is on this,
Sure.
is most scholars in the mainstream see Yahweh and El as having been syncretized, and that's why the terms become interchangeable at some point. But as I pointed out with a few other texts, these predate that syncretism. So the argument that these terms were interchangeable doesn't necessarily actually apply here. So what's your position on that?
Okay, so repeat the names.
So okay, so in the case of, for example, Deuteronomy 32 8 through 9, or Deuteronomy 32 in general, the Song of Moses. Numerous scholars have, including many that Heiser has cited, show that Deuteronomy 32 is from a point in time before the syncretism of El and Yahweh. In the mainstream, most see the reason that all these El epithets, like Elyon and El and Elim and such, are being used to reference Yahweh is syncretized during the 8th century. What's your position on that?
So, let's see if I understand your question. Is if these terms like El Elyon and all these other things would be synchronizations of Yahweh, and that this somehow indicates a different God other than Yahweh?
It's that my question is, what is your position on the fact that Deuteronomy 32 precedes the proposed date for the synchronization?
My position on the idea that the Deuteronomy precedes some sort of synchronization, I affirm that Deuteronomy has always taught a concept of monotheism within the Bible, regardless of the different name that would be used. That would be my position.
Okay. So here's another one. What is your position on the fact that almost every scholar in the mainstream views the Song of Moses, Deuteronomy 32, 1 through 43, as being completely separate from the rest of Deuteronomy?
Well, as far as the Song of Moses, I'll have to know what you mean by that as concerning that. But as far as Deuteronomy 32 being separate from Deuteronomy, I would have to again need to look into that for the case, because at the moment, from what I have observed in scholarship, regardless of there being mainstream ones and a majority of them, what I see is that the Deuteronomy 32 is part of the biblical text of Deuteronomy. So I don't see anywhere or any way that would suggest it's not part of the canonicity of the Deuteronomy text.
Well, no, I'm not saying that. It's that it's coming from an older tradition and was inserted into the Deuteronomy
Right,
text.
and I would disagree with that and say that I don't think there's any good, legit reason to affirm that to be the case, that it comes from some earlier tradition before this whole thing here about Deuteronomy, or even just Israelite religion in general.
Okay. I would. Okay. I find that interesting because Michael Heiser actually even attests to this.
Right, and I don't agree with Heiser
and,
on everything.
Yeah. I mean, I don't agree with Heiser on most of this,
Right.
but I do agree with him here. He cites Paul Sanders, if I remember correctly. He did a monograph on it from Brill. So here's another one then. What is it? How do you define a god?
I define a god simply as, in terms of the term Elohim. I personally wouldn't use the word God in reference, especially in, like, say, a church service, or when I'm out street preaching, or in certain theological discussions with people that are unfamiliar with these kind of contexts. So the most appropriate term that I personally would use would be that of a spiritual being or an angel, depending on the context, because I believe that in general this simply refers to that of a spiritual being in the spiritual realm versus the natural realm that is on earth or in the physical that we have.
Okay. So how do you deal with the fact, though, that the angels are regarded as gods in the rest of the culture, messenger akin to Hermes? Marcus Smith has a whole chapter on it, actually, in Origins of Biblical Monotheism, notes the term its cognate appearing in Ugaritic texts frequently.
So how do I?
What's your position on that? Since we have tons of cognate literature that refers to them as actual gods,
As to being worshipped as such.
Yeah, they were.
Right, and I would say that this is a case where people had basically done what we see within Romans 1, where they would take the created and worship it, including that of these other different figures that would be in the divine heavenly realm, and would attribute them even sometimes to statues and idols. Hence why sometimes the term Elohim is specifically referring to that of what the statue or the idol in general is supposed to represent. And it's not like they're just simply trying to base it off of something that they have in their heads and in their imagination, though sometimes that was the case. But that there was some sort of concept where they were familiar with that of the supernatural, that of the divine realm, of these divine beings, and they could base it off of that. And that would have been very problematic. And as I mentioned from what Bill T. Arnold and Richard Hess notes, this was something that in the Old Testament was shown to be something frowned upon, discouraged, and sought to seek the replacement of, with replacing polytheism or these other different false worship concepts with the concept of monotheism found in the Old Testament.
Okay. That really doesn't clarify things too much, though, because even the other Canaanites would have admitted that the angels were created beings, all children of El, all created by El and his consort Ashura. So that, but they would still be considered just as much of a god as any other figure.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to take problem there. But I have some questions. I think we're going to run out of time here soon, so I'll just ask one more. In regard to Psalm 82. Zieni Zavit, one of the most preeminent scholars of ancient Israelite religion, notes that in Psalm 82, the redactor's work in this poem created confusion. Elohim is both a divine name and a generic term in here. He also notes that what has likely happened is that the well-known Psalm 82 may have told originally about a deity concerned with justice rising in El's congregation. And that the redactor has been editing these out to. So I'm curious what your position on that is.
I would have to see where these redactions would be possible, or where there's a background that allows us to see these redactions, because we could say that, but then where exactly do they take place? Would the redaction be within where the singular concept is of Elohim, where it says God standeth in the congregation, and then we have he judgeth among the gods? Which is it? Is it going to be there? And then concerning the redacting, at least as far as what I understand from somewhat of source criticism that is used here, how do we know that these are part? That, in other words, that we have a different narrative here, that this is like one different God and this the congregation of another God. So that would be the question that I would have to ask on that, though not expecting you to answer. I'm just saying that that's pretty much how my position and my response would be to that.
Okay. Well, with that, I think my time is up for the cross-examination, so it's to you.
All right, and this may end shortly because I didn't really. This is a first for me where I don't get enough thoughts to ask a lot of questions. So I will say this: so you agree that the different names that are used can be used interchangeably?
Depending on the time period, yes.
So what do you mean by depending on the time period?
Because I hold with Mark S. Smith, John Day, and most mainstream scholars that at one point they were syncretized, and so texts before that, that are coming before that, older traditions, cannot be associated with those divine names necessarily. though they cannot all be equated.
Okay, so how do we know which time period these would belong to?
We can look at the text linguistically. For example, Psalm 82 is an example which David Robertson does go over, but actually more particularly prevalent is Deuteronomy 32. Both David Robertson, Paul Sanders, and Simon Negosian note the strenuous lacks of matrice lectionis, which is typical of older Hebrew before the Babylonian exile and before the Josiah. We also see more conservative spellings being used. There are also older archaisms prevalent throughout the text as well. All of it is seemingly indicative of a text that is as old as the century BCE. It's dating. Both of them date anywhere between 10th and 11th century. Negosian in particular favors in that.
Okay. So, what's another question I could ask? So, what did you make of the? Okay, well, here's the main thing. It just not got back to me. I almost lost it for a second. So, what you do? If I'm not mistaken, you did say that at one point, that there is monotheism in the Old Testament. There's just a certain period or degree. Where would you say that the period cuts off at, where it is most certainly monotheistic?
I would say where it starts being completely and utterly monotheistic is actually going to be around the time of the composition of Daniel and like around the 3rd century BCE. But I think we see the first argumentation towards that in Deutero-Isaiah, starting chapters 40 through 55. In there we have strong anti. We have, for example, equating all the other gods to being wooden idols. We have them being equated to being crafted by human hands, etc., etc. They're all fake. So in that regard, I would say that probably post Babylonian exile is when truly starts developing.
Okay. So, regarding some of the so I noticed that you definitely had a chance to bring up plenty of scholars. Would you have had any issues with what was cited from James Newell?
I'm not actually familiar with Newell's work.
Then at least to focus on at least the Yahweh and Elohim portion. How about Kasuto? Because I know you definitely don't ascribe to the documentary hypothesis, but a different theory. So hence why it definitely would be. It's definitely strange considering the documentary hypothesis was what Kasuto was wrestling with.
I agree with some of Kasuto's observations. I definitely think that there are times where biblical writers were definitely using these terms to express differences in the representation of Yahweh. However, I do think that it's a bit short-sighted, especially because his writings are coming before the serious dissemination of Ugaritic texts and other Canaanite texts that have been being discovered. I think that by and large, Frank Moore Cross has shown quite a few of his observations to not hold up, especially in regards to Genesis. And I think Dr. Mettinger has also shown well, so that we find that these L terms were the leftovers of a Israelite society that was still working L.
Mm-hmm. All right. Alright. Well, honestly, I think that's all I can really ask concerning my particular question. So, thank you for that. Alright. So, now we have 5 minutes of closing statements, and then we will have 15 minutes to answer as much questions as we can. And we're already getting several bits of it. So if y'all have any leftover questions, feel free to check them out, and we will see what we got. So go ahead, Chris, with your 5 minutes.
Okay, so overall, I do still think that there are polytheistic elements in the Bible. Do I think that they were worshiping gods over Yahweh? I do not think that was particularly the case. For the biblical writers, I do think that they thought there was a god over Yahweh. Some of them thought there was a god over Yahweh at some point, but Yahweh was always the special god, the one that they chosen to follow. He was the divine ruler of Israel, and he was their greatest god. I think that that trying to water down the terminology of Elohim so that they are divine being, spiritual being, really does not pay threat to the cultural context from which these texts have arisen. Ultimately, I think that the strongest arguments that are going to still last are going to be Deuteronomy 32, Psalm 82, Genesis 14, 18 through 20, and sub 22 as well. And so I'm just going to leave it off with noting that these are also not detrimental to theology of faith either. These are the views of Presbyterian ministers David Noel Friedman and Patrick Miller. Patrick Miller does not agree with the Deuteronomy 32 interpretation, but matter. These are the views also of Othmar Kiel, who is a Protestant theologian, and also of Rainer Alberts, who is a Protestant theologian as well, and the views of Michael Coogan, who's a devout Protestant, Mark Smith, who is a devout Catholic, Trigve Mettinger, who is also, and Peter Enns, who is also a devout Protestant as well. These are not extreme. These are not meant to be a detriment to anyone's faith. These are all I'm seeking here is to show that yes, the Bible did at some point, in some passages, attest to there being numerous gods, and that these gods were a reality to be dealt with. With that, RCA.
All right. So thank you for that. And I will begin my closing statements. All right. So, and this was interesting and very shocking to me when I heard this in the closing statements. To some degree, I can actually agree with my opponent. There are different Elohim, and that Yahweh was the only one worshipped, and that he was the special one. I would agree with this concerning that. The only difference is how we interpret and define Elohim in this regard. As I pointed out, I define it simply as that they are spiritual beings, but he would define it as gods and would refer to it in the sense of a polytheistic context, regardless of which context that you would go with, whether it be in the form of monolatry or henotheism or any other different sects and branches of polytheism that you would want to call it or refer to it as. However, there is one point I do want to correct that I definitely know we will disagree on. I do believe indeed that the idea of polytheism is damaging to the faith, regardless of certain Protestant and Catholic theologians and scholars. And the reason why is because the idea is detrimental to the faith, especially when the fact is that the New Testament and Old Testament, and I cite New Testament because that is definitely part of the standard for the Christians today. And while we didn't debate the New Testament, a Christian, such as what we're supposed to expect out of people that are claiming that Protestant and Catholic background theologians and scholars, should be able to identify and recognize the essential concept of God in the Bible, especially in light of the verses that we went over in Deuteronomy and others that do indeed point out that, as my opponent pointed out, there is none like Yahweh, or however else he gets referred to as in the text of Scripture. Isaiah 44 verse 6, Isaiah 86 verse 10, Psalm 83 verse 18, Deuteronomy chapter 6 verse 4, a definite key monotheistic text, Deuteronomy chapter 4 verse 35, and several other passages. And though while Psalm 82 and others most certainly refer to the concept of these other Elohim that are there, we still do read of something that involves this one concept of a God here that is supreme over all the other Elohim. And that while you have those that are referenced there, we can go over other theologians and scholars that would be on my side of this debate, especially that of a Presbyterian by the name of John Frame, who in his systematic theology goes to great lengths to defending the concept of monotheism, especially from a philosophical viewpoint. So there are other scholars and theologians that I could point out that would be on my side. So it doesn't matter about that we have these other people and they may claim to be of this. The point should be, what is the evidence? And the evidence is one thing that I could definitely say, which I'm very confident about, that both me and my opponent have laid out. We've laid out our case, and that should be up for you people that are watching to decide, is that concerning the issue, keep in mind that indeed the idea is detrimental to our faith, especially concerning what the New Testament, which we definitely know is monotheistic, in the Old Testament, which I have gone over, and what we have debated would affirm monotheism. So based on that, if indeed the text of the Bible does teach monotheism and we affirm something that is besides that, then what we are doing is worshiping a false god. We are therefore committing a sin, especially for those who are brothers and sisters in Christ that would be affirming this concept. And that would be something we would need to repent of. So hence why this indeed is an important issue, and why if the position that I am affirming is correct, then it would most certainly be detrimental to the faith, because then it would be violating the concept of do not worship any other god besides me, or even the concept of what the other texts seem to indicate and what this opens the gateway up to. So that being said, that'll be all that I will say, and I end my time. So we now have time for a 15-minute Q&A from certain people. I already took a few questions down. There's others that have been coming in, so we'll start with what we can. By the way, I'm picking up a bit of an echo. Yeah, from you.
Okay. Okay. Is that better?
Check. Okay, now it's good. Yeah. I'm still hearing it a little bit, but hopefully we can get through it. So let me go ahead and start off from the top of the list where we got, starting now. Okay, so HistoryNet has a question for you, Chris. Would you say the historical Moses was polytheistic or monolatrist? Or monolatralist?
I don't think we can actually determine either way. I don't think we have enough solid information on Moses. The Exodus is written too late for it to be completely solid. I would say that we can be probably most certain that his chief deity was Yahweh. Whether or not he worshipped other gods, or was monolatrous, or was monotheistic, is a different issue that I don't think we can answer right now.
Mm-hmm. All right. So thank you for your question there, HistoryNet. For those of you that are watching, keep your questions coming in. We got about almost 14 minutes, because it's almost about to get to the 14-minute line, of time to answer your questions. Everything Biblical asks, why do you assume that Moses and Abraham left their beliefs in the pagan Egyptian gods? I make that based on what the scriptures point out, that they are simply in reference and talking and worshiping of one God specifically, and not in their beliefs of following after these other different deities in pagan or Egyptian manners. So based off of the scriptural evidence we can find in the Bible, as I've definitely mentioned for Moses several times during the opening statements, about a monotheistic worship and concept of only one God, Yahweh, or Elohim, and different other names as we've gone that can point out that it can be interchangeable, that indeed it is safe to assume they have abandoned these concepts and in search for pure monotheism. So thank you for your question there. Okay. Let's go to Salem Coupe, who has a question for both of us, though I only am going to answer the second part due to the fact that I've already explained what my thoughts on Heiser and Divine Council pretty much is. during the debate, since that was part of my material. But the question, so yeah, for you, the question is, what's your thoughts on Michael Heiser and the Divine Council? But for me, I'll answer as well as you can later. Couldn't you classify the Old Testament, First and Second Temple Judaism, as henotheistic? No, for me, I would still classify the concepts as monotheistic for especially the Old Testament. As far as First and Second Temple Judaism, it would depend on what is in there. I still need to do research into the history of First and Second Temple Judaism. And if there's any groups that come out within Judaism that do claim some kind of thing of henotheism, I would say that there would be something. But much like how Alan Siegel would probably say that the two powers view would be considered a heresy, I would probably then be on the same route as that concerning that particular route. So yeah, that would be my answer to that.
Okay, so my view on Michael Heiser, I think his work is okay, but I think he definitely waters down his terminology to appeal to a more conservative mindset. I think that he definitely plays fast and loose with Elohim and what constitutes a deity. Especially when you look at at all the research that other scholars have done, he is a little bit negligent with some of it. As for Second Temple Judaism, yes, I would actually characterize some of it as henotheistic. As I've noted before, we have texts where Enoch, Elijah, Moses, priest, and the author of the text itself are all deists. So.
Mm-hmm. All right. Let's see. All right. The next question this apparently went to our Discord server. So I guess this one's for me. According to my definition, a religion that worships a supreme being who rules over all things and is the first cause of nature, I didn't use those words, but alright, would be monotheistic. It appears that this would make the Greeks monotheists. Most glorious of the immortals, invoked by many names, ever all-powerful Zeus, the first cause of nature, who rules all things with law. Hail, it is right for mortals to call upon you, since from you we have our being. We whose lot it is to be God's image, we alone of all mortal creatures that live and move upon the earth. In your invincible hands, your eternal two-edged lightning-forked thunderbolt. By its strokes, all the works of nature came to be established, and with it you guide the universal word of reason, which moves through all creation. It says Klenthes. So concerning this whole thing, I would not consider the Greeks monotheists, because again, I didn't say that there would be sort of I simply said that there is a spiritual being, and that then there would be this one that is in charge over all the other the angelic beings or other spiritual beings. Doesn't mean that these necessarily have to have any power in themselves, and even if some of them do, that would automatically make them gods. Remember, I mentioned simply saying that there were spiritual beings. I wouldn't call them gods, because I think that would mischaracterize and would put them as something that historically they never were to begin with. They would have called them a god back then, but it would have a different meaning, just like back then there were certain terms like vulgar back then doesn't refer to cussing like it does now, or any sort of profane language, but instead it would refer to simply something that was common. There's a certain word that rhymes with bag, but it starts with the letter F. In America, it's a slang that's derogatory against those of the LGBTQ community, whereas over in England it's slang for a pack of cigarettes. So when we have context, and especially that within culture, I think that is important to keep in mind, especially. So that would be why I would disagree with your interpretation of my definition, and why I definitely don't think that the Greeks would have been monotheists by any sense. Okay. So, by the way, for y'all that are watching, keep tuning in your questions, and we will take them up. Because at the moment we only have one more, and this one comes from Milwaukee Atheist, who has a question for Chris. So his question is, what would be the purpose for the inclusion of Deuteronomy 32? I forget the specific verse. If it was previously polytheistic.
The verses are specifically 8 to 9, and we have the caveats commonly brought up are in verses 5 through 6, and 7 as well. The reason for actually having it is because of its attribution to Moses. Because of it, and also likely because of the age and the importance of the tradition itself. This is why we'd have numerous different traditions, and then why they are also then edited so that they are more monotheistic in nature instead of polytheistic. So their nature is probably the reason they're in there is probably due to the importance that they're serving in society. Similar to Psalms that we have, originally probably entitled Baal, and then were switched so that they were altered so that they were instead applied to Yahweh. It was just the common thing to do.
By the way, I've just been informed that my audio was cutting out a bit, so that definitely points out that that's probably then with your audio cutting out, definitely a bit on my end then. The stream has been going, but seems that might be the whole thing of where the audio goes. At that point, I'm just going to have to move my camera back a bit. So, anyways. So,
do we have any more questions?
Well, the only thing is a response from Scott. So, if anyone is watching, again, please feel free to send in more questions. We got about 5 minutes and 30 seconds left. And if we don't get any within the time, then we will just have to cut it short and let that be the night of the debate. So Scott Preston asks, in response to my answer I gave to him, how is this view of Zeus not monotheistic according to your definition if Zeus is the most glorious of the immortals, the all-powerful creator? In Clynthius' view, it is by the power of Zeus that all the works of nature came to be established. How is that not monotheism according to your definition? Because again, then there would be the affirming of these other different gods and deities, especially in that mythology, that Zeus wasn't the only one that would be in there, but there was a bunch of other different gods. And I'm the one that's saying that monotheism doesn't have gods, and I explicitly defined what would be called gods in this Hebraic, Jewish, monotheistic context that would actually mean what we would today call simply spiritual beings. And I mentioned that that's key in understanding this whole thing here. So the idea about Zeus supposedly, in my definition, being monotheistic is again showing that a lack of understanding of what my definition is, because I explained multiple times that it means no other gods, and that these other Elohim are simply spiritual beings, angelic beings, or even just that, just within the spiritual realm. Hence why in 1 Samuel, that Samuel himself is referred to as an Elohim. It's not meaning that he was a god, hence no Mormonism at this point, but rather than it's simply referring to him being part of the spiritual realm, and that is where he now resides. So that is simply it. I mean, there's no other way I can put it other than that.
So, can I ask you something, since we have no one else asking questions yet?
Sure. Yeah, sure.
Okay with that? Okay. So, what's the difference between a spiritual being and a god?
So, concerning the difference between a spiritual being and a god is the idea of a certain set of attributes that would define the person as the concept of a god. Rather be.
Okay, so, what are the attributes that make something a god?
So, concerning some of the attributes would be the eternality, would be the supreme control over all things, even if it's a certain task over a certain object, being having absolute power over these certain things. So those would be some examples as well. I mean, some of a more detailed example of this can be found in A.W. Pink's classic book on this, of the attributes of God.
Yeah. Okay. I was just curious. The ones you mentioned actually would apply to the Malak, particularly the Satan. But yeah.
The Malak, the Satan.
The Malak and then also the Satan, I should say.
Okay, because I would disagree on that. But all right.
Also, if they require eternality, would technically nothing would be a god, except for very specific things. Most gods in any ancient literature aren't actually eternal.
Right.
But Milwaukee Atheist asked you.
I was about to read that. I didn't know if you had more to go on, but thank you for your question, though. By the way,
no,
just want to let you know that. Kind of unrelated, but yeah, what is your position on the authorship of the Torah? I do believe that a majority of it is Mosaic, and that some of it is concerning the anachronistic portions. Some of the third person references to Moses are indeed from a non-Mosaic author that comes later. One of it, I would assume that the part of especially that writes of the death, would come from somebody that would be of Moses's. I would assume Joshua, and then other portions that would indicate a certain different period of time would be scribes that would basically be rearranging the text and changing the name places depending on what the name would be called. So that would be my particular position on Mosaic authorship. I already did a video on documentary hypothesis, which I tried to learn from in my interaction with other people, and so I do plan to make a sort of rearrangement of that would probably go to 30 minutes or 45 minutes after I do extensive research and go over the data, because that is indeed what needs to be pointed out when dealing with certain bits of information, and realizing that it's not just simply documentary hypothesis, but rather that it's about these other different theories that are out there and how to deal with some of these things. Well, that's definitely a signal right there that the timer went off.
The timer is over.
So, folks, that has been the debate. We thank y'all for tuning in. I may or may not. I definitely know it's going to be probably a little too late for me to even try to attempt. You know what? I might just go just for fun. So I'm probably going to head to karaoke after this. So thank y'all for tuning in. And thanks to Chris for allowing us to do this in a non-professional format. We're sorry we couldn't do this on Modern Day Debate, but we hope that this was sufficient enough and that y'all got enjoyment out of this, as well as learn from this as much as both of us did. So that being said, this has been RC Apologist. Take care.